Hello YouTube. Yes, we are back in the conservatory again, and yes, we're working on an NC23. So as you recall, I sold the one that we built in the last series, and I'm actually giving this one a bit of a winter refresh and a major service. So just going through it all ready for next season. Now, I did mention in the videos when we were talking about suspension options for the CV1 that one of the things you could do is to retain the standard forks and fit a set of emulators. And it just so happens, set of emulators like this, and it just so happens this is a job that I need to do on the NC23 here. Now, the forks on the NC23 and the CV1 are essentially identical. The only difference is obviously the NC23 has got twin calipers, and the actual position of the caliper mounts is different. So I thought it'd be quite handy, make a video of me stripping this down, fitting the emulators, and if you did decide you wanted to go that route with the CV1, well, it certainly wouldn't be a bad idea. So let's grab some tools, and I'll just move the camera down a little bit, and we'll get this front end off. So as usual, the first thing I want to do whilst the bike's sort of nice and stable on the ground is just loosen everything off. And yeah, so when it's up in the air, we're not fighting against any stuck bolts. So obviously the first things to come off are going to be the calipers. Rather than leave the calipers just floating around in mid-air, where I'm going to end up bashing them and obviously putting a bit of strain on the actual brake hoses, it's not a bad idea. Grab yourself a bit of string and just tie them back up to somewhere on the frame where they're out the way. Come here, you bugger. Which of course is easier said than done. Okay, so that's him out of the way. And I'll just loosen off the two pinch bolts while I'm here. And then do exactly the same on the other side. Okay, next thing I want to do is the pinch bolts for the top yoke. Actually, it'd be a damn sight easier I move the clip-ons on that side because the brake master cylinder gets in the way. Right, I'm going to leave the bottom pinch bolts in place until we actually get the front end up in the air. Because obviously the last thing I want is the fork sliding through at the moment. And talking of which, just need to loosen the front spindle. Okay, so one of the problems you tend to have with these bikes is how to lift the front end off the ground. You can, of course, put it up on paddock stand at the rear, but of course you use a front paddock stand, it actually goes in underneath the forks, and we actually want the whole front end unsupported. So something that's worth getting, if you haven't already got one, is an ABBA stand. And the ABBA stand normally goes through the swing arm spindle. If, like me, you're too tight to buy an ABBA stand, you can always make your own version. And what this can do, it's a 10mm rod across here, and that will actually go through the two front engine mounts. So I'm just going to take those off. Now, of course, you don't have to go to all the effort of making a copy of the ABBA stand. You could just take the front engine mounts off, put a bit of bar through them, and then actually sit the bar up on some car axle stands or something of that nature. Socket only just fits in the crash bung, so it does tend to get stuck. Right, do the same on the other side. Okay, now to fit the front stand. This can sometimes be a little bit tricky. There we go, that's the front end up in the air. So fairly secure. So let's get back to taking the front wheel out. Stick that out the way in the corner. Right, next thing is loosen off the fork tops. Now I should have done that before I put it on the stand, to be honest, but I forgot. Now it's quite handy loosening off the fork tops at this stage because the forks are clamped by the bottom yokes, which is why I left them intact. So I'm literally just going to give them about a turn just to loosen them off. Whenever you're undoing the fork tops, always make sure that the top yoke clamps are loosened off, because obviously they pinch around the forks and they will actually clamp against the threads on here. So that's that done. Now all we've got to do is drop the forks out. So let's start with the right hand side. I've also noticed that my mudguard bracket is split, so I'm going to put another one of those on. Okay, so there is our fork leg. And if you recall last time, before we actually take the spring out, you do want to loosen off the bottom bolts. So let's just drop them in the vise. Which of course you can't see at the moment. There we go. And again, we're just going to loosen it off rather than remove it. Does help if you use the right size bit. Too bad actually. Sometimes they can be a bit of a pig. Right. Okay, move you back up again. I'm going to go and get my oil bucket. Right. Now, as you can see, I've actually nicked the preload adjusters off an NC29, might even be an NC30. Doesn't hurt to back off all the preload. Now, obviously, if you've just got standard NC23 forks, they don't have the adjustment. And I bet now I've done that. Oh yeah. And just get ready for the fork top to jump off. There we go. One fork cap. One spacer. And there's the spring. Which of course it's going to do its absolute utmost to spill oil everywhere. The trick is not to pull it out too fast, give the oil a bit of a chance to drain off. Okay, now it's just a case of emptying out the old fluid. Right, I'm just going to put that over here to drain. And I'll do the same with the other one, and then we'll come back and we'll look at a bit more detail on the fork emulators and what you need to do to actually fit them. So I'll see you in a minute. Okay, so I've let all the oil drain out of this, and now we finish undoing the bottom bolt. And we should be able to just slide out the damping rod. And you'll notice that it's got the 4 holes in the bottom. And it's this damping rod that we need to modify. Now, the observant amongst you will probably notice that the fork slider has changed colour. In fact, not only has the fork slider changed colour, but it's lost a caliper mount. And that's because this is actually a CV1 fork leg. I actually had a bit of a problem with the NC23 fork legs, and I will show you that now. Just let me get this out of the way. Right, when I came to undo the damper bolt at the bottom, removed everything, I couldn't get the damper rods out. They were just stuck solid in inside the fork tubes. And the reason for that is these forks have actually had replacement stanchions fitted. They came from All Bike Engineering in Woolwich, and they're a bit of a budget option. And it turns out the wall thickness on the replacement tubes is slightly greater than the wall thickness on the Honda ones. And what that was doing was the damper rod was just jamming in there. So I had to go away and have a little bit of a think about how best to get the damper rods out. And like all things, the solution was surprisingly simple. So I will show you that now. Once I've got it clamped up. Okay, so I'll put the spring and everything back in just to put some tension on the damper rods, and then I am going to undo the damper rod again. Now you have only got an 8mm hole in the bottom to try and get the damper rod out, and yeah, you could resort to a length of bar and a hammer, but I actually came up with a solution that was blindingly simple and quite obvious. So I've got a length of 8mm threaded bar, or I think we call it all stud in the States. Now this stuff is absolutely rubbish as a bolt because it's got no tensile strength at all. But it is handy to keep a few lengths of this around the workshop. Comes in about 1 metre long length, and obviously you can see I've cut a bit off this. But it's really handy for odds and sods around the workshop. So I've grabbed a length of the threaded bar, and all I'm going to do is just screw that into the end of the damping rod. And now I've got something I can actually push on to get the damper rod out. So if I just remove all the fork internals again, and you can see I try and do the same as we did with the other one. The damper tube gets so far and then it sticks. So by pushing on the end of the threaded bar, out comes the damper rod. So handy little trick if ever you find the damper rods are stuck. So let me just have a quick clear up here, and then we'll come back to the bench and we'll have a look at the actual emulators themselves. Okay, so I've cleared some space on the workbench, and we'll get one of the emulators out so we can actually have a look at how they work. Like I said, I will put a link down below to the Racetech website, and they do a really good article on emulators, how they work and why they work. So this is your standard damping rod, and as you can see there are 4 holes in the bottom. So you've got 2 here and 2 up here. Now it's these 4 holes that basically restrict the flow of oil through the damper rods and through the fork. And the way the emulator works is it actually sits on top, and rather than relying solely on these 4 holes to control the flow of the oil, the emulator has this spring-loaded top. Now, hopefully I can just demonstrate that. And as the fork compresses, this top part will actually open and close, and that controls your compression damping. Now I didn't realise with the YSS emulators they only control the compression, they don't control the rebound. The Racetech ones, they are more expensive, but they do both, and you can adjust the tension on this little spring to alter as and when the this little plate opens. Now obviously with the emulator now controlling the flow of oil through the damping rods, we don't want these holes to restrict it. So what the instructions say is you actually need to drill another pair of holes. So those are the original ones at the top, and I've just added 2 more holes. So you need to keep at least 10mm between the centres of the holes. So they're just 8mm holes, so I've just drilled 2 extra holes, gone round with a file, totally deburred them inside and out. So I've used a half round file inside and a normal file outside, and then given them a really good wash in the parts washer to make sure there's no swarf. And like I said, now the emulator sits on top here. Because we've got the extra holes, there's no restriction at this end of the damping rod. All the restriction in the flow of oil is now at the top. So all that we need to do now is reassemble the forks with the modified damper rods and drop the emulator in. According to the instructions, this should be preset to somewhere between 7 and 12 Newton meters. Now, I'm assuming out the box that they are set to the right value, because my little torque wrench doesn't go down that low. So I'm just going to have to take it in good faith that they come supplied already pre-set up. Certainly they're both measuring the distance from there to there on both the emulators. They are identical, so I think it's a fair assumption. So let's go and zoom out a bit, grab the fork, and let's reassemble it, get some oil in and get these forks completed. Okay, so time for reassembly. Now that I've had a bit of a clear up. So we're going to take our little bit of studded bar, and I'm just going to screw that into the bottom of the damper rod, so that hopefully we can now pull this through the fork leg. The hardest part is going to be aligning everything up. There we go. And you can see there's a bit of bar pulled through. And that will now pull the damper rod into place. And what I am going to do is just quickly tuck the spring back in. Along with the spacer. And just get that damper rod tightened into place. So let's just move you back down a bit. Okay, so now I know the damper rod is properly seated. I can screw it into place. Now, quick word about these little copper crush washers. Officially, you should replace them every time you change the undo the damping rod, but they're a bit of an oddball size. I don't have any spares, so I think I'm going to get away with, you can usually get away with it a few times. The problem is they are a bit of a pig to get onto the bolt, so you kind of have to put the bolt in and then put the copper washer on through where the axle goes. Come on. Right, so with a bit of pressure on the end of the fork leg, we can now tighten that all up. So that's that tightened, and then we take the spring and the spacers out again. I guess no one ever said it was going to be easy. Now, talking of the spacer, obviously I've already shortened these to allow for the extra distance on the preload adjusters, but you also need to shorten them to accommodate the emulator, because obviously you've added that to the overall stack height of the springs and the spacers. So I'm going to go away and cut those off camera, but we don't need to worry about them just yet. Okay, so we've got the damper rod in, it's been modified, and the rebound spring. So now we just add oil. Because the YSS emulators don't control the rebound, I am going to stick with the 15 weight oil. Normally you'd use 10, which I think is fine for a road bike, but with this being a track bike and me being a bit heavier than most younger Japanese riders, I'm going to stick with 15 weight oil. Now the trick is, because obviously we need to bleed it through the system, is to just put enough oil in to cover the end of the damper rod, and then bleed it through the system, because obviously we want to drop the damper rod in and make sure, or the emulator in, and make sure it sits firmly on the damper rod. So that should now be bled through after a couple of pumps, and I can just see the top of the damper rod. And of course the emulator won't drop in straight, so just use the spring to push it down. Hopefully, let's get a torch. I can see it isn't sat correctly. There we go, that seems to be seated properly, but let's give it a pump or two and see what happens. Right, now we fill up with oil. Give it a couple more pumps. And you can actually see the oil bubbling up through the emulator. And you really just want to keep doing this until you don't see any bubbles in the oil. Okay, I think that will do us. So I'm just going to top up the oil. And now we can set up the air gap. So to do that, I've got my handy little fork oil adjuster. Which of course always ends up messing me about. The joys of cheap tools, eh? Let's try again. Just going to coat the plunger with a bit of oil just to lubricate things up. Here we go. Right. Set for your air gap. And although there are graduations on the plunger itself, I do just want to double check. Right. This is one of those jobs where you really could do with an extra hand, but okay, that's our oil gap sorted. So that's with no spring or spacer in and the fork tube fully compressed. Now we can go back, add the fork tube, add the spring, just be very careful when you lower it in, because sometimes you can put it in and the oil splashes back out. So spring, spacer washer, and I'm going to go and cut down the spacer, but I don't think we need to see that. So the actual emulator itself is about 14 millimeters. So I'm going to take 14 millimeters off the end of this. And in fact, I'm going to do the same on the other one. And that is the forks reassembled. So yeah, that is emulators. I won't show you putting the forks back in because it's the same as it was taking them out. So that is it for this video. It turned out to be a bit of a pig actually, mainly because of the problem with the damper rods. So what I thought was going to be a quick video has taken me about 2 days, but never mind. Anyway, that's it. Thank you all for watching. Like I said, fork emulators are really good, fairly inexpensive way of upgrading your standard forks. Certainly a lot easier than going for the whole front end swap that I'm doing on the CV1. So, thanks for watching, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. One last thing I thought I'd better add. When I was talking about the mudguard brackets, I mentioned you can buy them from AliExpress. And here is one of the AliExpress ones. Now the first thing you'll notice is that they don't come with the metal inserts in them. So you are going to need to steal those from your original fork legs. But more worryingly is the fact that, I don't know how clearly you can see this, but on the top of the original Honda ones there is a little chamfer just here. Hopefully you can just pick it out, probably about, yeah, not really showing up very well on the camera. But take it from me, there is a small recess machined in the top of the mudguard bracket, and the idea is it allows the clip to go in and sit in this groove and then hold the bracket and stop it from riding up. Now the AliExpress ones don't seem to have it, which means that when you go to fit your clip, it's got absolutely nowhere to go. So if we compare that to the original Honda ones, you can see how the clip just snaps in, and now the mudguard bracket is held in place. So not the end of the world for me, because I can just chuck them in the lathe and just machine out the little groove in here. But if you are thinking of buying these from AliExpress, be aware you're going to have to go around with some sandpaper or a Stanley knife and just take out the edge so that they will actually clamp on the forks. And like I said, you will need to nick the metal inserts. So that's it guys. Just thought I'd better add that before I finish the video.